Hi, Professor Olson, back for Chapter 7, Late Antiquity and the Emergence of the Medieval World. There's a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible. But the reason we call this period Late Antiquity is in part thanks to historian Peter Brown, who also argued for a period of accommodation and acculturation as Rome fades and new influences come in. Then there's this peaceful amalgam, and as we're going to see, that's not so peaceful. But it does make a profound impact, changing the world, because we're going to see what we consider classical Greece, classical Rome, the antique, age, the ancient age, is going to fade and be replaced by this late antiquity period, which is now going to be, in a way, similar to the Hellenistic period, with more and more cultures beginning to show up, more and more cultures beginning to influence one another. But we'll go into all of this, and as I said, I'll try to make this as painless as possible because there are a lot of shifts here. All right, so now the other term I want to mention too is medieval. When we talk about medieval, it's French for Middle Ages. History as a discipline really began to take off in what we would call the early modern or Renaissance period. And they knew this. They knew there was a past time, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So of course they started calling that the ancient world. And they knew that their time was their now, but they didn't quite know what to do with everything when Rome falls in 476. So between 476 forward to their time in the 13, 14, 1500s, what do they call it? It's the middle of things. Therefore, they called it the Middle Ages. So even today, when historians talk about time periods, we talk about the ancient world, we talk about the Middle Ages, we talk about the early modern period, and then of course we talk about the modern period, and some argue we're now in postmodern, so that'll be something for historians to possibly change as we go forward. But for now you understand why we call it the Middle Ages, or in the French, medieval. All right, so just so you have some grounding for the terms. All right, so moving along, we've looked at how the Roman Empire begins under Augustus, and of course the annexation of the Mediterranean continues. We see them take over Spain, Egypt, so many different places, millions of square miles of territory. But unfortunately, the cost of defending empire is very, very high. And you might remember I mentioned a lot of the Roman men did not want to become soldiers anymore. It was hard work and not a lot of pay. So of course, with everybody going into trade and commerce, there are shifts that are going to start to undermine the Roman Empire. Lack of soldiers. Now we have to bring in auxiliaries, people who were foreigners who were hoping to get Roman citizenship or benefits by working with Rome. Also, as more and more people dealt with China and the Silk Road, more and more trade shifts toward the east to accommodate that, which is going to, as you're going to see, leave the west and Rome, the title city itself, very much in a precarious position. All right, just to give you a little background. All right, by the time Diocletian takes the throne, he realizes that the economics are terrifyingly bad, and he actually divides the empire up into western and eastern halves. And this is an effort to help save money. It's an effort to help keep the economy afloat. And he was also hoping, by establishing this tetrarchy, tetrarch from four, tetra in Latin, he was hoping to bring stability to the empire and have an orderly succession for the emperorship. So what happens is you have two Augustus titles, one in the east, one in the west, and they are the senior member, and then they take on apprentices, if you will, Caesars, who are to be their understudies and be ready to ascend when necessary. So that it's somewhat like the five good emperors we looked at, where they would have a more orderly succession and not having to worry about heirs was both good and bad. All right, so each one has their section. And unfortunately, once Diocletian passes, Constantine decides he wants not only his piece of the pie, which was the East, but he wants the West too. And he's going to reunite the empire. And for a short time, this is going to be successful. But again, those problems haven't gone away. The economic issues, having enough people in place, being able to defend the borders, all of these problems have not gone away. And in fact, they're still getting over the inflation from the terrible 200s and 300s, as we're going to see as we go through this. All right, but Constantine does something different. Not only does he take over the tetrarchy and turn it into, again, one emperor, he also tolerates that new religion, Christianity, and in fact recruits Christians to help him to reunite the empire. All right, so when he comes to power, he issues this Edict of Milan, which tolerates Christianity and Zoroastrianism. So they're not necessarily the state religions, but they're now tolerated, and some Christians even get restitution of property and things that they had lost when Christianity was outlawed. So the Christians especially benefited from Constantine taking over. All right, he tears down a Greek town called Byzantium, and this is important. You'll see why in a minute. He razes everything to the ground and rebuilds and creates his own city, Constantinople. All right. As more and more Eastern influences come into play, and we have the split, the final split between the East and the West, the East will now be called the Byzantine Empire after the split, in part because of Constantinople being built on this site of Byzantium, just so you understand the terminology. All right. So, and of course, during his reign, Constantine is worried about church matters. He wants the church to be standardized. He wants it to be under government control. He increases the bureaucracy. All right, he increases more troops because he knows the problems. So a number of people are recruited into the army and they're given incentives to join. All right, so all of this culminates for him in the Council of Nicaea, which will standardize church worship. It will standardize what we would now today call the Bible. Certain apocryphal books will be left out: the Book of Enoch, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Bell and the Dragon, all these different books that weren't quite seen as truthful and written by the apostles or Old Testament figures. All right, so the Council of Nicaea will standardize church leadership, but will also leave women out of church leadership. When all the house churches were going on, a lot of women opened their homes. Now all of the church will be run by men. All the offices will be filled by men. So it's a major step forward for standardizing the church. And of course, this also results in one other ruling, which was to create the council, in the Council of Nicaea, which was to say that Christ and God were of the same substance. So God and Christ are the same. And you'll see why this is important in a little while when we talk about heresy. All right. So what I do want to bring up, though, is some of the economic changes. So the church actually gets more recruits because if you're poor and you're male, you might want to go join the church as a way to stay, fed and clothed and sheltered. All right. Also, tax revenues. Constantine standardized tax collection. In the old days, if you were a tax collector, you would actually tell people what to pay, but you were probably overcharging them so that you could collect a collection fee. And then you would send what was necessary to the governing authority. Now, however, he wants to standardize tax revenue. He wants it to be collected regularly. All right. He also wants it to be more above board. All right. So, and here's where, when we look at the medieval period, serfdom is really born. remember all those wealthy landowners with the latifundia, those large plantation-like estates who had a lot of slaves on them? Well, now what happens is they are tied to the land by law. They and all of their descendants will be owned by the land. It won't matter who owns the actual estate, but by law, they come with the land. They're like treated more like trees and shrubs and geographical features than like people. They do have some rules, they do have some rights under these new rules, but all of these people are now literally going to be tied to the land. So slavery changes a bit, but it hasn't entirely changed enough. It hasn't gone away, for starters. All right. Also, later on, some of the colony, these slaves who were put out in the middle of nowhere on these big latifundia and basically left with no governing authority and just told, here, do your job. We'll check up on you once in a while, will also be serfs. And they will eventually be taken over by warlords as everything collapses. All right, just some things to think about. Constantine knows that in order to cement his reign, he needs big building projects, public works to put his name upon, to create jobs for people, to create a sense that things are moving forward. So, of course, he does these things, and of course, it strains the budget and the tax resources even further. All right, so just some things to help you understand where things are going. And of course, Christianity becomes a major unifying force. So if you're not so happy in this life, you have something to look forward to in the next life. That is the big draw for a lot of people with Christianity. Plus, if you remember, much like the mystery cults, it afforded an emotional experience and a way to connect with your deity, your God, in ways that the old imperial cults of the emperor and the previous gods, such as Jupiter and Mars, did not. All right. So Constantine, again, that Edict of Milan officially tolerates Christianity. All right. He actually did not accept the religion and really make a show of it until near his death when he was baptized. All right. And of course, interestingly, the next emperors who show up are also Christian. All right. Only one, which we'll talk about if we have time, only one relapses, if you will, back to the pagan religion. And then, of course, that's overturned. And moving forward, Christianity is pretty much the official religion. All right. So the other problem they had was heresy. All right. There were still people who were not at that Council of Nicaea who were getting information secondhand. The one heresy which is going to play a major problem for a while is Arianism, created by a churchman named Arius. Arius argued that Jesus was not divine. Remember during the Council of Nicaea, they said that Jesus and God were made of the same substance? No difference? Arius said no. Jesus was strictly human, and therefore he should be looked at as special, but not divine. And of course, if you look at the precepts of Christianity, this totally negates the whole premise, because Jesus is supposed to be divine in Christian belief. And if he's not, then who is he? And did it really matter that he died on the cross? And if you believe that he was resurrected. So, and I'm not getting into religious arguments here, but just from a strictly logical point of view, Arius and Arianism completely undermined what the Christian faith was supposed to be about. And there will be a number of enclaves who will believe in Arianism as opposed to the Orthodox faith for many, many years. And this creates a lot of problems. All right. So this is just something to keep in mind as we go forward. So questions of divinity. Who is Jesus? If he's not divine, who is he? Why is he important? All right. But of course, the Orthodox said, no, Jesus is divine. Jesus is the same substance as God. All right. But of course, this is a real problem. Now, of course, for the early church, although it's not so early anymore. All right. Now, you might remember I mentioned just a little while ago about the economic issues, all right? If you remember back to one of our last videos, we talked about Varus and the legions and the Teutoburg Forest disaster, the massacre, all right? The Romans could not move far enough north because the frontier was not helpful for the way they fought. They fought in phalanxes and turtles, and there's lots of trees, all right? So the Rhine and Danube rivers really had a very small Roman presence because, again, they can't go too far in, but the Germanic tribes who had begun to reach out to these garrisons and these outposts and other small Roman enclaves, they really liked what they saw. Roman goods were the best, and they would trade. And don't forget, Roman wine was amazing. All right, so they would trade back and forth. So there was some Romanization of the Germanic tribes going on. At the same time, the Romans, because it was so much colder than what they were used to, were adopting some of the German dress. They were wearing trousers, they were wearing wool cloaks, they were, you know, there was an exchange, a cultural exchange going on, all right? And sometimes they attacked the Romans if they felt that they could get their goods and not have to pay for them, all right? But remember, as Roman and Romans fall in the army, now they're reaching out to auxiliaries. They're reaching out to Parthian archers, and they're reaching out to Mithridaic strongmen, and they're reaching out to Persian charioteers. They're bringing other groups in to help replace the natives who were not willing to do the military work. All right, some of these Germanic tribes become part of these Roman auxiliaries. They invade, if you will, in order to gain the resources and the privileges, all right? And of course, what happens is, because more and more of the wealth is shifting to the east and Constantinople, the west is suffering. There's a big split. And what happens is, by the end of the 5th century in the west, the Romans still control the economic resources, but they're drying out, and eventually what's going to happen is the last emperor will be deposed in 476. Remember, I don't mention a lot of dates, but please remember 476. This is the official date the Roman Empire fell, all right? 7-year-old boy king put on the throne by his general father, Romulus Augustulus, or the little Augustus, and named for Romulus, of course, one of the legendary founders of Rome. Romulus and Remus, you might remember, suckled by the she-wolf, is deposed by Otto, I can never say his name, bear with me, Odoacer, all right? And what happens is, he's a Germanic man, but he likes the Roman culture. He really wants to preserve it. In fact, he went so far as to create 2 courts, one for Romans and one for his own people. But he's keeping as much of the traditions and the culture as alive as possible, at least in Italy. He wants them to maintain their unique characterizations. He admires them. But of course, the Westerners, the Roman Westerners, were like, but he's Germanic and he's now our king, and how is this going to work? And, you know, there's a lot of fear among the Romans. And of course, there were intermarriages going on. The Germanic invaders wanted to take Roman brides. And of course, eventually there will be no pure Romans. All right. So, and throughout the 400s until 476, more and more of these German-led, you know, these German Romans who were in the military were coming in, so they were already there. And they actually share some of their legal principles. For example, Wehrgeld, it's basically an honor price. So if somebody was offended and somebody was hurt or assaulted, rather than an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, they would be agreed to pay a certain price for a certain action. And eventually what happens is the leadership changes again, all right? And of course, it goes to Theoderic. And Theoderic winds up dying. And of course, there's yet another change. And for a short while, there will be a united very briefly, united two halves, Eastern, Western Roman Empire again, because of Justinian, who wants to bring back the Roman Empire as one of his acts as emperor when he takes the throne in the East. All right, we could talk about this all day, and I know that a video gets very long, so I'm just covering the highlights. All right, I mean, obviously I expect you've read the textbook. All right, and of course what happens is the Rome in the West falls yet again. It splits yet again. So Justinian has it for this brief and shining moment, but basically the East and the West really are now becoming two separate entities. And the Germanic kingdoms are really pushing the culture and everything else for this particular group. Now, if you remember, I mentioned religion and I mentioned Arianism. Arianism will only end once Clovis takes over in what will become modern-day France. If you've ever wondered why all these French kings are named Louis, it's actually a change in Clovis. It goes from Clovis to Louis. All right, mostly because the V becomes a U and they lose the C. All right, but with that in mind, Germany and France don't exist as entities until the 1800s. All right, so we're going to be talking about the Germanic and the Frankish peoples at this point. All right, now the Merovingians actually claimed that for their origin story, they were descended from this mythological monster Merovech, I guess to make themselves seem more, fierce. All right, but what's going to happen is Charles Martel, who's one of their palace officials, will actually begin to see the influence of the Merovingians fade because he's going to now deal with a new threat. Just as Christianity is taking off and becoming adopted in both the East and the West, on the Arabian Peninsula, there's another religious revolution breaking out. This will be the rise of Islam. And the Islamic movement was characterized in its earliest incarnation as Muhammad and his followers, Muhammad and his followers explode out of the Arabian Peninsula. They go all over. And one of the major regions they take is North Africa, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you look at the map, there's only a small distance to cross from North Africa over the water and into Spain. And the Al-Andalus area is going to be the prime point for the Muslims to gain a foothold into Europe. And Charles Martel defeats an Islamic army at Poitiers, and at that point he winds up establishing leadership over the Merovingians and becomes a king in his own right, basically. And now this is going to usher in a new era where the Muslims are going to move forward, the Europeans are going to push them back, they're going to move forward, the Europeans are going to push them back, the Muslims take ground, and it goes back and forth for about 700 years. Just keep that in the back of your mind, all right? Now, the Frankish group has blended Germanic and Roman traditions throughout their history and what they've picked up by being in the region. And now we need to talk too about England. There's going to be another people group that's going to emerge out of all of this. All right. I'm not going to worry so much about the early church right now, but I do want you to be aware of St. Augustine, who wrote Confessions and the City of God. Confessions is his own account of how he becomes a Christian and goes on to become bishop, and he's a major figure in the church. And his City of God will help to influence the Middle Ages. The idea is there's the City of God and the City of Man. And if you're heavenly minded, and therefore probably going to heaven, you long for the City of God. But if you are more of the earth and probably not necessarily thinking about God, you're more inclined to think of the city of man. And his argument, very briefly, in the city of God is you can pretty much tell where you're going at the end, but based on your particular love for the city of God or the city of man. All right. And Jerome will go on to help turn the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into Latin. All right. And also to purify, we'll put that in quotes, pagan literature, and find a way to use some of it to enhance Christian values. All right. There's not a lot of other things I want to cover in the early church at this point, other than to say that we do need to consider the Petrine supremacy, and then we're going to get to talking a little bit more about other people groups, I hope. Gregory consolidated the power of the papacy. All right. But Peter was one of the first apostles. All right. The Petrine supremacy is based on the story of Peter. If you look in the Bible, in the New Testament, Jesus says about Peter, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail." However, it's a bit of a pun. You see, Peter's name, Petra, literally meant rock. So Jesus, pointing at Peter, was saying, upon this rock, people, man, I will build my church. So, however, the keys that he supposedly gave them in the passage are not literal keys, they're figurative keys. The keys to death and hell, the keys to death and Hades, depending on which translation you read. So, with that in mind, the Petrine supremacy argued that since Peter, by tradition, being the bishop of Rome, was the first pope, even though the pope title was not yet assigned, it came out later, pope from papa, meaning father. Peter is traditionally seen as the first pope. Therefore, the Petrine supremacy argued that Rome, being the seat of the first Pope Peter, even though he didn't have the title, should be seen as having supremacy over the entire rest of the church. That Rome's take on things, Rome's voice, Rome's bishop, aka the Pope, should be in charge of the whole church. And of course, this is going to make the church split into two halves. We're going to have the West will become the Roman Catholic Church. If you've ever wondered, Catholic just means universal. And the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, in the eastern half of the empire. This is why they split. This is one of the reasons they split. Not the only, but one of the bigger ones. So the Petrine supremacy argues that the Bishop of Rome always holds the preeminent position in the church. All right, just in case you've ever wondered. All right. Again, a lot of hodgepodge of the church. You know, different things are emerging. Monasticism, more evangelism, taking over religious sites that were key for pagans and turning them into Christian centers. We could go on all day. Again, I don't want to keep you all day because I know you're very busy, but you know, and this is just an overview. All right. England. We need to talk about England. All right. First off, England is England. England was the home of the Angles. All right. Angles were tribal, but what happens is, as things change in what we would now today think of as Germany, in Saxony, one of the areas of what will become Germany, the Saxons look over to England and say, wow, that looks really good. I want to go there. There's land, there's opportunity. And other tribes from Germany and even Denmark, the Danes, a lot of Vikings will begin to make inroads into England. And they invade and they establish new kingdoms. The so-called Danelaw is where a lot of these Scandinavians wind up living. Some of them come peacefully to trade, others come to make war. Even today, if you look at a map of England and you see things like Wickham-shire or Ipswich, any town with W-I-C in it actually comes from V-Y-K or Vic, which is where we get, or Vike, which is where we get Viking from. Vikings could be, Viking, the word Viking for the Scandinavians could mean to trade or to raid. If they had a bigger force than you, you were probably trading. If they had a smaller force than you, you were probably raiding. All right, there wasn't a lot of difference in the Scandinavian mind, in the Viking mind between the two. It was all part of their culture. So if you look at all these different towns in England that have WIC in their name somewhere, chances are very, very high they were all originally small Viking trading posts where towns and cities sprang up around them. So you have the Angles, you have the Saxons, you have the Danelaw. All of these things come together, and this is why even today, if you look at the English language etymologically, I can't even talk today, etymologically, we have Viking roots, Scandinavian roots, Old Norse. We have German roots. We have German roots. And this is why English is so difficult for non-native speakers to learn, because we have so many different things mashed together. So if you've ever wondered anything about the history of the English language. So all of these groups come in and they find that all the Romans have either gone native and joined the population. It's claimed now today that perhaps King Arthur was actually a British soldier, or I mean a Roman British soldier who, you know, was there at the behest of Rome, and or went native, depending on which myth you look at. So Hadrian's Wall, remember, was to keep in the wins that the Romans had gained. Well, the Romans left or merged, and Hadrian's Wall basically became a curiosity. Even today, you can still find parts of it in England. All right, so now we have all these different people groups, the Angles, the Saxons, that's where we get the term Anglo-Saxon from, the Danes, the Danelaw, the Scandinavian groups. All right, all of these have established new kingdoms in England. And this also is interesting because the Irish come to help evangelize these so-called pagan groups. All right, and of course some of the Germans have already been exposed to Orthodox Christianity, and they help to spread it as well. Even today, a lot of these ancient and pagan beliefs show up in Christianity. We celebrate Christmas on December 25th because of Mithras, the soldier god from Rome. Saint Bridget was actually a fertility goddess in the British Isles. Even today, when we talk about celebrating Easter, it comes from the goddess Estra, which is where we get the word estrogen for women's fertility and women's hormones from. Estra was a fertility goddess. Her symbols were the egg and the rabbit. And the egg example was taken over by the monks to explain the Trinity. You have God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. You God, the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus. And in the egg, you have the yolk, the white, and the shell. All right, so all of these things happened because what they would do is they would reconsecrate pagan sites and pagan buildings and turn them into churches. So a lot of these things came in. Even the Christmas tree was a Druidic custom that was co-opted into the church. And of course, missionaries continue to go to places that they felt needed to be evangelized. St. Patrick's Day, for example. So just some things to think about. And the Christian church was, even though women couldn't serve in certain positions, in the monastic movement, women were able, by joining convents, to gain access to education, and abbesses ran the convents, all right? So, and some of them went on to become mystics, having visions like Hilda. So, and the monks, you know, in a way helped save civilization. So did the convents. They copied and preserved old manuscripts, things that would have been gone for forever. And they also created centers of learning. All right. So grammar, rhetoric, logic, these were studied in the so-called trivium. Now, if you've ever heard the word trivia, tree or tri, three, from the Latin, and vium meant ways. Trivia or trivium was actually when people gathered together at inns and they spoke to each other and they gained knowledge from one another about where they were going and where people had been. Trivia comes from trivium. So just in case you've ever wondered about the meaning of some of these words or where they've come from. All right, but the trivium for education was a major step forward, and this model would go on to be used throughout the Middle Ages. So grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And remember, logic and reasoning, of course, come from the Greek. See how things just build on one another? Isn't it great? So just some things to think about. Okay, but back to the East. The West is having its, its problems, culturally speaking, economically speaking. But the East has been humming along. The East has not felt all the pinches of economic difficulties, and it's not experienced so many cultural shifts at this point. It's the last gasp of the old Roman Empire, but even it is changing, all right? So think back. We talked about Byzantium being razed, turned into Constantinople, all right? They've also got the richer provinces that they're still working with, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Palestine. All right, Justinian was the one who tried to put the pieces back together again. You might remember the old nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty, and of course, once Humpty Dumpty fell, it was very hard to put the pieces back together. In a way, it's like the Roman Empire is Humpty Dumpty. It's broken, but Justinian tries to make it work. He throws a lot of money at it, fights a lot of expensive wars. He's determined he's going to get the West back. Unfortunately, for a brief and shining moment, he does, and then everything falls apart again. All right. And of course, his successors will also try and fail to put it back together again. Justinian is the only one who comes close to getting it back together again. But unfortunately, his gains are short-lived. All right. Now, his wife, Theodora, actually helps him with what will become his lasting legacy, which is codifying Roman law. Theodora was what we would now today call a carny. She came from carny folk, carnival folk. Her father was a bear baiter and had a dancing bear act. Her mother actually sold her into prostitution because they were so desperate for money. Justinian fell madly in love with her and had his father change the rules so he could marry his love. She was very good for him, and she also encouraged him to be, a more strong ruler. She also asked him to consider changing rules to issue more protections for women and children. All right. And with that, they had, they actually made a number of gains in codifying Roman law. I mean, he did, his name is on it, but her influence can be seen. All right, he codifies Roman law. And interestingly, this is the last major piece of legislation that will be issued in Latin. After this, because remember, it was built on a Greek site, the Byzantine Empire, they're the last gasp of Rome, but they're really not Roman anymore. They change over to Greek as their ruling language. All right. But for that last moment, they are the last gasp of the Roman Empire. And then they become more and more Greek. All right. And in addition, the Greek Orthodox Church, remember that split, the Greek Orthodox Church tries to make one last change to the Roman Catholic Church during this brief moment of unification. They argue that because they got rid of all their icons, these paintings of the saints, that the Catholics should get rid of all their statues, claiming it's breaking one of the commandments, about graven images. But while the Greek Orthodox Church performs iconoclasm, or the destruction of their icons, the Roman Catholic Church thinks about it and then says, no, we like our saints and it helps our parishioners because not all of them can read, and this way they can see the Bible stories and they can understand. So this doesn't happen for the West. It only happens for the East. But even the East eventually relents and brings back their icons. All right. But let's change over and look more and more at our religious issues. All right. So the Byzantine economy is suffering. Believe it or not, they are finally starting to feel the pinch by the time Justinian is getting to the end of his reign. If you are more interested in the Byzantine Empire, I highly recommend Justinian's Flee to you. It mentions about a plague, which also it predates the Black Death, but again, like the Black Death, it creates a lot of problems. A lot of people die or are ill. It impacts the rulers. It impacts the economy. It impacts the population. So, and there was a lot of trade flowing through Constantinople. So much so that when the Muslims do begin to have governing power, and they do establish what will become the Islamic kingdoms and empires, they keep looking to Constantinople, wanting to take it. Of course, that will take them many, many centuries, but they will ultimately make a play for Constantinople and succeed. All right. So just to give you an idea of how successful the Byzantines were, Constantinople had walls a mile wide, a mile thick. You could run, and they did, chariot races along the tops of those walls. This was a very prosperous, very well-defended capital. All right, just to give you some perspective. But let's talk about the rise of Islam. All right. You have Christianity, okay, it's fractured. You have the Romans, Roman Catholics, you have the Greek Orthodox, but overall they're pretty much agreed on the basic tenets. It's more the little principles of dogma and tradition they don't necessarily agree upon, and aka the Petrine supremacy for starters. All right, but when we talk about Islam, which Islam means submission to the will of God, Muhammad, a former merchant, marries a rich widow. He's from Mecca. He was born in Mecca. He has this idea, this vision. He's spoken to by Allah. And next thing you know, this new monotheistic religion is gaining popularity across the Arabian Peninsula. All right? And he doesn't write it down, but his followers will. The Quran will be written by his followers based on his wisdom that he imparts. All right? At first, it wasn't very popular in Mecca. He was actually driven out of his hometown. He moves to Medina, where they welcome him as a judge and an arbiter, and he gains a lot of converts. Eventually, he'll go back and take Mecca. And problem is, though, is having a line of succession. Unfortunately, he has daughters. He doesn't have a son. So this creates a line of succession issue. When he passes, Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, becomes the first caliph or deputy. There will be no other prophet in Islam except for Muhammad. It's one of the tenets. Muhammad is the only prophet. With the office of prophet now being vacant and Muhammad being gone to his heavenly reward, the caliphs, the deputies, are now responsible for administering this theocracy, because in Islam, law and religion are not separate. They are one. This is a theocracy. Theocracies are religious and civil and every other kind of law are all banded together. There is no distinction. All right. So the caliphs are responsible for administering everything. When Abu Bakr passes, Fatima, one of Muhammad's daughters, and her husband, Ali, were looked upon to be the logical successors. Ali would be taking over as caliph. A very long story, very short. Even today, there is still a divide in Islam, the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis, I think of them as the sunny side of the street because they're the majority. And then there's the Shiites, who are the minority. The Sunnis argue everything is gone as Allah wills. The Shiites, however, argue that Ali should have been caliph, but of course he was assassinated, which of course raises questions of who should have been successor. And to make it more complicated, in time, Islam splits, and so do the Islamic kingdoms and the Islamic empires. So we're going to see new Islamic empires emerge out of this. All right. So the Shiites want direct descendants of Ali. The Sunnis say, okay, well, everything's happened as Allah wills. So the Umayyads and their successors and their descendants, that's the way it should have been, because Allah willed it. That's how it happened. So even today, that continues. All right. And of course, if you've listened to the news, you've already heard of Sharia law. You know that it's very strict. You know that everything is looked at under Sharia law. All right, it's a very strict code. It deals with morality. It deals with civil issues. It deals with criminal issues. It deals with religious issues, again, because you have a theocracy. There is no line between state and church in a theocracy. All right, so these are just some of the things I want you to keep in mind. Even today, followers of Islam read the Quran, the Holy Book, a lot of surahs in there, these teachings. All right, so, and of course the 5 pillars of the Muslim faith. Allah is the only God. He is the supreme God. Muhammad is the only prophet. Formal worship, praying should be done 5 times a day, facing Mecca, the holy city. And even today, it's believed Jerusalem is a secondary holy site for the Muslim population, which of course makes things interesting in the Middle East, which is one of the reasons why even today Jerusalem is so contested, because it's the site of the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, you know, for various reasons and in various levels of importance. All right. And of course, much like Christianity and Judaism, they say that you should give, you know, money for charity, for helping the poor, the disadvantaged, the widows, orphans. All right. And of course, unlike Christianity and Judaism, they do not require a pilgrimage, but in Islam, you are required to make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in your lifetime. However, if you have illness or old age, you are exempted from this. All right. And of course, Ramadan is a 1-month fast. And when we talk about jihad, immediately, I know the popular conception is to think about war. Jihad is actually a struggle, an internal struggle to submit to the will of God, to submit to the will of Allah. All right. So originally it was about this internal striving. Some, however, now have taken this to mean armed struggle against unbelievers. And of course, in its earliest stages, Islam was a very outward movement. People were converted via conquest. All right. And of course, that changed over time. All right. But when we talk about holy war, that's a Christian concept, not an Islamic one. All right. And we'll get into that when we get into the Crusades. All right. So these are just some things I really want you to keep in mind as you go through the chapter. All right. I don't want to get too far ahead because I don't want to get things muddled. All right. And as you can see, during this period, we start to see more of what we would perceive as medieval fashions. The Roman fashions are on the outs because this is now the fusion of these Germanic and Roman influences. All right. As you can see, the Roman Empire gets partitioned for the Tetrarchy, East and West. All right. Constantine. As you can see, a lot of the Germanic tribes migrate, and the reason they migrate is not because they really want to, so much as there's pressure from the Huns. The Huns live in the steppe. The steppe is, if you will, the sea of grass. And as they move, because the steppe is drying up and it's a great ecosystem for them and their steppe ponies who are uniquely suited for this, they have to keep moving, and they're moving east. I'm sorry, they're moving west, because in the east, the steppe is drying up. They're losing the ecosystem. They've got to keep looking for food and resources. And that pressure drives these Germanic tribes further and further west and into Roman territory. Also, the Huns are plundering, and they are actually, sacking cities, which also lends to the fall from 476 with the Roman Empire, especially in the West. All right, the West is heavily impacted by all these nomadic movements. All right, and of course, as you can see in England, we have the Saxons, we have the Angles, and the Danelaw cuts right across the middle. Okay, Visigoth architecture. The Visigoths will take over Spain, and then of course they and their descendants will be involved in a struggle with Islam as the Islamic groups move from North Africa into the Al-Andalus region. All right, a lot of our art has become increasingly religious at this point. Of course, by the Middle Ages, the church will be the biggest patron of the arts, and into the Renaissance. All right, and just so you can see, Arian heresy for a while, and then that's taken over into Orthodox. As you can see, the artwork has gone from hyper-realistic to flat and more like the medieval period. The perspective, believe it or not, will actually be lost until around the Renaissance. All right, so now more and more our art is going to become two-dimensional. There's going to be no shading. There's going to be no tricks to make that 3D perspective pop. All right, and as you can see, Constantinople is the largest city in Europe for some time because it's the last survivor of Roman Empire when there were big building projects. All right, a lot of knowledge is lost, including knowledge of the dome and the arch. Architecture will become very rudimentary for some time. All right, as you can see, the Byzantine Empire, it's not very big, but it's mighty. Mighty in terms of economics. So, and of course, Islam starts on the Arabian Peninsula, and here is the other problem the Byzantines have is the Sassanids, the Persians, will also be a real threat, but it's going to be the Islamic kingdoms who will eventually take that rich prize of Constantinople. All right, of course, Ramadan. Now, interestingly, Islamic art starts out much like Western art. They have people represented and animals, but after it's realized that this seems to be going against the commandment of not having any graven images, Islamic art will only concern itself with passages from the Quran, and calligraphy will become the major art form going forward. All right, and of course, as you can see, Muhammad and his successors slowly move out from, I shouldn't say slowly, they push out from the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, it's, like any other empire, it's slow going to get all of the territory, but they go over to what used to be Persia, they spread out through Egypt, even today into North Africa, and then of course up into Spain, and they're pushing to try to get through to what will become France. All of this is a major explosion. And even today, a lot of these regions are still, to some extent or another, Muslim because of these previous patterns of movement. All right, so there's your timeline. I hope this video has been helpful. I know I've covered a lot of ground very, very quickly, but I just wanted to give you the highlights. Again, this is available without my narration under documents and resources. And of course, office hours, just check your announcements. I will be posting the link for office hours again. Reach out to me by email, whatever you need. I want to see you all succeed and get through this class. And I hope you have a great day. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. Take care, and we'll talk again soon. or at least as best as we can virtually. All right, thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye.